In 2015, archaeologists excavating a pit in Herxheim, Germany, made a calculation they initially refused to publish. The number of humans processed at this single site, defleshed, marrow extracted, skulls opened and scraped clean, exceeded 500 individuals. The site shows no evidence of famine, no evidence of siege, no evidence of survival necessity. The bones were processed with the same precision the same culture used to process cattle. This wasn't desperation. This was methodology. That is number one. But before we get there, we need to understand the world that produced it. A world where violence was not the exception, where the capacity for organized atrocity did not wait for cities or states or armies, where the darkest behaviors in the human behavioral profile were already fully operational 130,000 years before anyone built a wall, drew a border, or gave a name to the concept of an enemy. Number 10. The murder of Ötzi. On September 19, 1991, hikers Helmut and Erika Simon discovered a human body protruding from a glacier in the Ötztal Alps on the Austrian-Italian border at 3,210 meters elevation. They assumed it was a recent accident victim. It was not. Radiocarbon dating conducted by the University of Innsbruck established the body as belonging to a man who died approximately 5,300 years ago, around 3,300 BCE. He was between 40 and 50 years old. He had been naturally mummified by the ice within weeks of his death, preserving not just bone but soft tissue, stomach contents, clothing, and equipment. He is the best preserved prehistoric human ever recovered. His name, assigned by researchers, is Ötzi. For more than a decade after the discovery, the cause of death was listed as exposure. Ötzi was a shepherd, the consensus held, who had wandered too high and died in a storm. His last meal, identified through gastric analysis as red deer, ibex, einkorn wheat, and various plants, suggested a man at rest, not fleeing. The equipment found with him was sophisticated: a copper axe, a yew longbow, a quiver of arrows, a fire-starting kit. He was, by every measure, a competent, well-supplied man of his era. Then in 2001, radiologists Paul Gossner and Eduard Egarter Wiegel at the Regional Hospital of Bolzano discovered something in a routine X-ray review that had been missed for 10 years: an arrowhead, lodged in Ötzi's left shoulder. The flint point had penetrated at a steep downward angle, severing the subclavian artery. He would have bled to death within minutes. The arrow shaft had been withdrawn or broken, but the head remained. The wound angle established that the arrow was fired from below and behind. Ötzi was shot by someone positioned downhill while he was moving uphill or standing still. He never saw it coming. Additional analysis published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2012 identified defensive wounds on Ötzi's right hand. Deep cuts between the thumb and index finger consistent with gripping a blade during active fighting. These wounds had partially healed. They were days or weeks old at the time of death. Ötzi had been in a prior physical altercation before his final ascent into the Alps. He was not fleeing a conflict. He was returning from one. DNA recovered from Ötzi's copper axe, bow, and clothing found the blood of 4 separate individuals. 2 from the arrowhead lodged in his shoulder, 1 from his knife, 1 from a single tear in his coat. He had fought multiple people in the days before his death and was finally killed while moving through mountain terrain at 3,200 meters above sea level. The truly disturbing aspect is not the murder itself, it's the precision of the ambush. Whoever fired that arrow knew exactly where Ötzi was going, followed him into the high Alps, waited for the right angle, and took the shot. This was not a moment of rage, it was a planned execution. And whatever Ötzi had done, or what someone believed he had done, was enough to justify tracking a man into the highest terrain in Europe to make sure he did not survive. No perpetrator was ever identified. The motive remains unknown. Somewhere in the genetic lineage of modern Europeans is a descendant of the person who stood on that slope in 3,300 BCE and released that arrow. They have no idea. Number 9. The Skull Nests of Ovnet Cave. In 1908, archaeologist Robert Rudolf Schmidt was excavating a small limestone cave in Bavaria, near Nördlingen, when he encountered something that would not be properly understood for decades. Inside 2 shallow pits, which he called nests, he found 38 human skulls. The skulls were arranged facing west in concentric rings, like objects placed with deliberate care. Each skull was coated in red ochre. Many showed traces of periwinkle shells and deer teeth arranged around them. Ornaments placed at the time of deposition. The site dated to approximately 8000 BCE, placing it in the Mesolithic period, more than 3,000 years before the construction of Stonehenge. The ornamentation suggested ritual. The red ochre suggested deliberate ceremony. For most of the 20th century, Ovnet was classified as a burial site, evidence of ancestral veneration, perhaps a community's honored dead, preserved in a manner that spoke to spiritual belief. In 1991, physical anthropologist Bruno Freyer and colleagues published a reassessment in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology that fundamentally changed the interpretation. Of the 38 skulls, 27 of which belonged to children, 9 to women, and only 2 to men. The vast majority showed evidence of perimortem trauma, blunt force injuries to the rear of the skull, cuts to the vertebrae at the base of the neck. The cut marks were not random. They were precise enough to indicate deliberate decapitation using a stone tool, applied with a knowledge of anatomy. The 38 individuals were not buried here. Their heads were deposited here. Their bodies were left somewhere else, or destroyed. What arrived at Ovnet were severed heads, some of which still had lower vertebrae attached, suggesting the heads were removed when flesh was still present on the body. The ratio of victims is significant. 2 adult men, 9 women, 27 children. This is not a warrior's death toll. This is the profile of a group after the warriors have been removed, either killed elsewhere and left or taken. What remained was deposited in a cave, arranged in a pattern that someone considered meaningful and treated with ritual care. Red ochre applied to the skulls of children who had been decapitated. The scale, 38 individuals from what was almost certainly a single community, represents a catastrophic elimination of a population group. At Mesolithic population densities, 38 people could represent an entire social unit. The community that performed this act may have been numerically comparable to the community they destroyed. The question that mainstream archaeology has never answered is why the heads were kept. Why arranged? Why ochred? What belief system required a person to carry 38 severed heads into a cave, arrange them in concentric rings facing the same direction, and decorate each one? The bodies were discarded. The heads were preserved. Whatever the heads contained, identity, spirit, power, was considered worth keeping. Whatever the bodies contained was not. Number 8. The Eulau Massacre. In 2005, construction workers near the village of Eulau in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany, uncovered a series of graves that archaeologists from the State Museum of Prehistory in Halle initially estimated at around 4,600 years old, placing the site at approximately 2,600 BCE. What they found in those graves changed the understanding of what prehistoric family units actually look like and what could happen to them. 13 individuals were buried in 4 separate graves. The burials were unusual from the first examination. The dead were positioned facing each other, some with arms around each other, some with hands intertwined. One grave contained a woman and a child. Another contained a man, a woman, and 2 children. In each case, the postures were not the standard extended burials of the corded ware culture of this period. These individuals had been placed by people who cared how they were found. Wolfgang Hack and colleagues at the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA published DNA analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2008 that confirmed what the arrangement suggested. The individuals in each grave were direct biological relatives. The man, woman, and 2 children in the largest grave were a nuclear family: father, mother, and their children, confirmed by mitochondrial and Y chromosome analysis. The others were similarly structured: parent-child pairs, siblings. All 13 individuals showed perimortem trauma, massive blunt force injuries to the skull, multiple strikes in most cases. The force required to produce these injuries was sufficient to collapse cranial vaults. The injuries were concentrated on the backs and tops of heads. The women and children showed more strikes on average than the men, suggesting the male members of these families died faster. The most disturbing detail is not the violence. It is what the graves tell us about who survived. Someone buried these people. Someone had the time, the knowledge of the family relationships, and the emotional investment to arrange a man, a woman, and their 2 children in a grave with their arms around each other. That person or group survived whatever happened at Eulau, knew these families personally, and buried them with demonstrable care. The attack was targeted. The dead were family units. The survivors, who may have been from the same community but were absent during the attack, or who escaped, Returned to bury the dead. In 2600 BCE, in a farming settlement in what is now eastern Germany, a group of people experienced the total elimination of their immediate families and then performed one of the most human acts imaginable. They came back and put the pieces in the ground. No evidence of the attackers was ever found at Eylau. The motive is unknown. The families have been reassembled, identified, and named only by their DNA and the position in which they were placed. They are the earliest genetic family units ever confirmed by scientific analysis. Number 7. The Talheim Death Pit. In 1983, construction workers in Talheim, Baden-Württemberg, Germany, uncovered human remains during road development. Excavation by archaeologist Joachim Wahl established a pit containing 34 individuals, 16 children, 9 adolescents, and 9 adults, dating to approximately 5000 BCE. The population belonged to the linear pottery culture, or LBK, a farming society that had spread across Central Europe between 5500 and 4500 BCE. The LBK built the first permanent agricultural settlements in Central Europe. They are the culture that introduced farming to the continent. The 34 individuals were not arranged in any burial configuration. They had been thrown into the pit randomly, bodies overlapping, limbs in unnatural positions. Analysis conducted by Wahl and Hans-Georg Zilling, published in Germania in 1988, established that every single individual in the pit had been killed by blunt force trauma or penetrating wounds to the skull. The weapons left distinctive marks: an adze, a flat-bladed woodworking tool, and a shoe-last celt, a characteristic LBK stone implement. The injury patterns were forensically precise. Almost all the wounds were located on the back and left side of the skull. The geometry of the strikes, applied from behind and to the left, is consistent with right-handed attackers striking individuals who were either kneeling or being held. The 34 people at Talheim were not killed in combat. They were executed. Demographic analysis of the remains revealed a specific absence. Of the adult victims, there was a significant deficit of young women. The bones of women in the expected reproductive age range were largely not present. The men were present, the elderly were present, the children were present. The young women were not. This is the same pattern found at multiple contemporaneous LBK massacre sites across Central Europe. The implication, and it is one that archaeologists have been reluctant to state directly, is that the young women of Talheim were not killed. They were taken. The 34 people thrown into the pit represent the individuals the attackers had no use for. Those they did have use for were removed. The weapons used at Talheim were LBK tools. The attackers were not outsiders from a different culture. The adze and shoe-last celt were standard implements of linear pottery culture settlements. Whoever killed the 34 people in Talheim came from an LBK community. This was not an external raid by an alien culture. This was one farming community attacking another farming community that farmed the same way, built the same longhouses, and used the same tools. European agriculture arrived with organized massacre as one of its documented behaviors. The LBK expansion across Central Europe was not simply a spread of technology. It was, at multiple documented sites, accompanied by the systematic elimination of entire communities. Number 6. The Potocani Massacre. In 2019, researchers led by Mario Novak at the Institute for Anthropological Research in Zagreb, Croatia, published findings in PLOS One regarding a mass grave discovered near the village of Potocani in northern Croatia. The pit contained the skeletal remains of 41 individuals. The deposit dated to approximately 4200 BCE, placing it in the late Neolithic, the same broad period as the Talheim and Asparnschletz sites in Central Europe. The demographic composition of the Potocani pit was striking. Over 70% of the victims were between the ages of 15 and 35. The sex distribution was approximately equal. These were not the elderly, the very young, or the specifically targeted. The Potocani victims were overwhelmingly young adults, physically capable, productive members of a population, killed and deposited in a single event. Trauma analysis documented in the published report found that 21 of the 41 individuals showed evidence of perimortem cranial trauma, multiple blunt force impacts. The impacts came from multiple directions and from multiple angles, indicating multiple attackers striking each victim. Several individuals showed evidence of having been struck both from the front and from behind, ruling out any scenario in which the victims were simply not defending themselves. Paleogenetic analysis ancient DNA recovered from the remains produced a result that the researchers described as highly unusual. The individuals in the pit showed extremely low genetic diversity. They were highly related to each other, more so than would be expected in any normal village population sample. The 41 people killed and deposited at Potocani came disproportionately from the same extended family network. This was not a random cross-section of a community. This was a specific group, possibly a clan, a lineage, an extended family unit, that was targeted and eliminated. The genetic signature of the Potocani population was subsequently compared to surrounding Neolithic populations and found to align closely with Anatolian Neolithic farmers who had migrated into Europe in the preceding centuries. The attackers, whose genetics are not represented in the pit, remain genetically unidentified. The Potocani massacre sits within a documented pattern of extreme violence in Neolithic Central and Southeastern Europe that spans a period of several centuries around 4,200 to 4,900 BCE. This is not a single aberrant event. It is a data point within a cluster. Whoever the aggressors were across these sites, whether a single expanding cultural group or a reaction to resource stress or both, they operated with sufficient coordination to locate, surround, and systematically kill populations of dozens at a time, leaving no archaeological signature of their own identity. Number 5. The Aspern-Schletz Massacre. In the late 1980s, excavation of a late LBK settlement at Aspern-Schletz, Lower Austria, directed by researcher Eva Lennes of the University of Vienna, uncovered something inside the outer ditch of the settlement that transformed the understanding of prehistoric violence in Europe. The ditch, which had functioned as a defensive perimeter around the settlement, contained the skeletal remains of at least 67 individuals. Subsequent reassessments have pushed that figure higher. The settlement at Aspern-Schletz had been a functioning village. Post holes indicated longhouses. Ceramics, grinding stones, and animal bones indicated domestic life over an extended period. The ditch itself was a standard LBK feature. These settlements almost universally enclosed themselves with a U-shaped or Y-shaped trench, the function of which was long debated. Aspern-Schletz settled that debate. The ditch was a defensive structure, and it did not work. The 67 or more individuals found in and around the ditch had been killed and left where they fell. There was no burial, no arrangement. The bodies were left exposed to weathering, to scavengers. The bones show gnaw marks from dogs, and to the elements. Some individuals were found at the base of the ditch. Others were found in collapsed positions, suggesting they had been thrown in, or had fallen while trying to escape. Several individuals were found in postures indicating they had been running. Demographic analysis produced the same pattern documented at Talheim, 50 kilometers to the northwest. The elderly of both sexes were present. Male adults were present. Children were present. Young women in the approximate age range of 15 to 40, were almost entirely absent from the victim assemblage. Of the 67-plus identified individuals, the number of women in the expected reproductive age category was statistically negligible. The settlement at Aspern-Schletz was never reoccupied. The longhouses were abandoned. The ditch was never cleared. Whatever life had existed in this village ended on a single day, and the evidence of that day was left in place while the survivors, or the perpetrators, moved on. Pigs and dogs that had been kept as livestock were also found dead in the ditch. They were not butchered and consumed. They were simply left. Here is where the Aspern-Schletz evidence becomes genuinely disturbing beyond the massacre itself. The consistent pattern across multiple LBK massacre sites, Talheim, Aspern-Schletz, Widerstedt, and others, of absent young women is not a statistical artifact. It is a behavioral signature. The people carrying out these attacks were not simply eliminating rival communities. They were extracting specific population segments from those communities before killing everyone else. The young women of multiple LBK settlements across multiple decades and potentially centuries were taken. Their fate is unrecorded. Their genetic contribution to subsequent populations is a question that ancient DNA analysis is only beginning to address. Number 4. The Crow Creek Massacre. In 1978, during construction of a water treatment facility near Crow Creek, South Dakota, a backhoe struck a deposit of human bone approximately 90 centimeters below the surface. State and federal archaeologists were called in. What they recovered over the subsequent field season represented the largest prehistoric massacre site in North America. The remains of 486 individuals were excavated from a single mass grave dating to approximately 1325 CE. The 486 individuals belonged to the initial coalescent culture, a plains village society that had established a fortified settlement near the Missouri River. The settlement had been fortified, a palisade wall and a deep defensive ditch had been constructed around the village, indicating that the community was aware of the threat it faced. The defenses had been insufficient. Physical anthropologist P. Willey, who led the skeletal analysis and published his findings in a comprehensive report through the University of Tennessee, documented what may be the most thorough catalog of perimortem violence ever assembled for a single prehistoric event. Of the 486 individuals, virtually all showed evidence of perimortem trauma. 90% had been scalped, identified by cut marks on the outer surface of the cranium in the pattern produced by scalping with a stone blade. Many had been decapitated. Hands and feet had been severed from a significant proportion of the bodies. Tongues had been cut out, identified by cut marks on the inside surface of the mandible. Eyes had been removed. Teeth had been knocked out. The victims ranged in age from infant to elderly. The youngest identified individual was estimated at under 2 years of age. No demographic segment was spared. Unlike the LBK massacre sites of Europe, there is no documented pattern of young women being removed from the Crow Creek population. The killing appears to have been total. The bodies had been left to decompose and be scavenged before burial. The bones show extensive gnaw marks from carnivores, wolves, dogs, indicating exposure of weeks to months before someone returned to enter the remains. The burial itself, the mass grave, was the work of survivors or members of an affiliated community who came back after the attackers had gone. The truly disturbing aspect of Crow Creek is the timeline of the fortification. The community had built walls. They had dug the ditch. They knew they were in danger. The defensive infrastructure was not the response to the attack. It was the preparation that preceded it. They had anticipated what was coming, built what protection they could, and it was not enough. The palisade was breached, the ditch was crossed, and after the killing was done, the site sat open for months, the dead exposed, until someone came back and put 486 people into the ground. Number 3, the Jebel Sahaba battlefield. In the 1960s, American archaeologist Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University excavated a cemetery on the west bank of the Nile near Jebel Sahaba, in what is now northern Sudan. The site, designated Site 117, dated to between 13,400 and 14,400 years ago, placing it in the late Pleistocene, approximately 12,000 years before the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. It is the earliest confirmed evidence of organized human warfare in the archaeological record. Wendorf recovered 61 burials. 59 of the individuals were available for analysis. Of those, 24, just over 40%, had flint projectile points either embedded in their bones or found in the body cavity in positions consistent with having been lodged in soft tissue at the time of death. These individuals had been killed by projectile weapons. The kills were distributed across sexes and ages. Men, women, and children were represented among the dead. What made the Jebel Sahaba assemblage uniquely significant was not the number of projectile kills. It was the healing patterns. Many of the individuals who had been killed by projectiles also showed evidence of healed injuries from prior attacks. Fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, healed cut marks, old wounds that had been sustained and survived in earlier confrontations. These were people who had been in violent conflict before, had recovered, and were then killed in a subsequent event. This is not a single massacre. This is evidence of sustained, recurring warfare over a period of time sufficient for wounds to heal between engagements. In 2021, researchers led by Isabelle Crevecoeur at the University of Bordeaux published a comprehensive reassessment of the Jebel Sahaba. Remains in the journal Scientific Reports. The new analysis used micro-CT scanning and revised osteological methods. The findings doubled the known incidence of trauma, identifying violence markers that had been missed in the original 1960s study. The percentage of individuals with evidence of violence rose significantly with the new methodology. The Jebel Sahaba population lived at a time of severe climatic stress. The late Pleistocene in North Africa was a period of oscillating resource availability as the last glacial maximum ended and rainfall patterns shifted. Competition for the resources concentrated along the Nile, fish, game, wild grain, may have driven the sustained conflict documented in the cemetery. But whatever the cause, the behavioral profile is not ambiguous. Here is what Jebel Sahaba implies. The capacity for organized, sustained, multi-engagement warfare against identified enemy groups, including the killing of women and children, was fully operational in human populations 14,000 years ago. There is no developmental period in the archaeological record before Jebel Sahaba that contains comparable evidence. Jebel Sahaba is not the beginning of warfare. It is the oldest site where preservation conditions allowed us to see it. The behavior was almost certainly older. How much older is a question the fossil record cannot currently answer. Number 2. The Krapina Neanderthals. In 1899, Croatian paleontologist Dragutin Gorjanović Kromberger began excavating a rock shelter near the town of Krapina in northern Croatia. Over 4 field seasons, he recovered what would become one of the largest assemblages of Neanderthal remains ever found. More than 900 bone fragments representing the remains of at least 23 individuals, including men, women, adolescents, and children. The deposit dated to approximately 130,000 years ago, the last interglacial period, well before modern humans had migrated out of Africa in any significant numbers. The individuals at Krapina were Neanderthals. What was done to them was done by other Neanderthals. The bones recovered from Krapina were fragmentary to a degree that initially caused confusion. The material was broken, scattered, and mixed in a way inconsistent with deliberate burial. Gorjanović Kromberger proposed a cannibalism hypothesis early in the analysis, but this was contentious throughout most of the 20th century. Many researchers preferred interpretations involving secondary burial, carnivore disturbance, or natural decomposition. Mary Russell of Case Western Reserve Chist University conducted a detailed analysis of the Krapina material published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 1987 that re-established the cannibalism interpretation on firmer methodological ground. The bone fragments showed cut marks produced by stone tools. The cut marks appeared in patterns consistent with defleshing, removal of muscle from bone, and were located on anatomical surfaces where meat-bearing muscles attach. Long bones had been split longitudinally to extract marrow. The treatment was identical in both location and technique to the treatment of large animal bones found in the same deposit: deer, bear, cave rhinoceros. The Neanderthal bones had been processed by the same hands, using the same tools, in the same manner as the food animals at the site. The 2019 study published in PLOS 1 by David Freyer of the University of Kansas and colleagues examined 1,255 Neanderthal specimens from Krapina at high resolution and documented 16 cases of cut marks on the cranial vault, the top of the skull, consistent with scalp removal. These marks were not incidental. Scalp removal produces a specific cut mark pattern on the exterior of the skull that is distinguishable from defleshing patterns on other anatomical regions. The Krapina Neanderthals were not simply consumed. Their scalps were removed. Whether this was a feeding behavior, a ritual act, or both cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. What can be determined is this: 130,000 years ago, a group of at least 23 Neanderthals, adults, adolescents, children, were killed and processed at a rock shelter in what is now Croatia. The processing was systematic and complete. The individuals were not buried. They were consumed. The bones were discarded with the food refuse. Modern humans arrived in Europe approximately 45,000 years ago and overlapped with Neanderthals for at least 2,600 years before the Neanderthal lineage disappeared entirely. The cognitive and behavioral capacities that made Krapina possible were fully developed more than 80,000 years before that contact. Whatever happened during the period of overlap between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, Krapina establishes that Neanderthals were not incapable of organized systematic violence against their own kind. The question of what role, if any, that behavioral profile played in the eventual disappearance of the Neanderthal lineage remains open. Number 1. The Herxheim ritual cannibalism site. In 1996, construction work near the village of Herxheim in Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany, exposed human bones in a series of pits arranged around what had been a linear pottery culture settlement dating to approximately 5000 BCE. The site was excavated under the direction of Andrea Z. Blantz of the Directorate General of Cultural Heritage, Rhineland-Palatinate, with analysis conducted in collaboration with researchers from the University of Bordeaux and the State Museum of Prehistory in Speyer. What the full excavation revealed required more than 15 years of analysis before the implications were formally published. The bones at Herxheim showed cut marks, percussion fractures, and processing patterns consistent with cannibalism. This was not in itself unprecedented. What distinguished Herxheim from every other prehistoric cannibalism site was the scale, and more critically, the context. Isotopic analysis, strontium and oxygen isotope ratios extracted from tooth enamel, is used in archaeology to determine where an individual spent their childhood, by comparing the isotopic signature in the teeth to regional geological baselines. The isotopic analysis conducted on the Herxheim remains, published by Zeblands and colleagues in 2009 and in subsequent papers through 2016, produced a result that archaeologists had not anticipated. The individuals were not from Herxheim. They were not even from the region. The isotopic signatures indicated that the people processed at Herxheim had come from an area stretching across Central Europe, from the Rhine-Moselle region to the Paris Basin, hundreds of kilometers in multiple directions. They had traveled to Herxheim, or they had been brought there. The total minimum number of individuals identified at Herxheim through fragment analysis was revised upward multiple times as excavation continued. Early estimates of 500 were confirmed and eventually exceeded. The bone material represented people of both sexes and all age categories. There was no demographic filtering evident in the remains. Not a warrior population, not a sacrifice of a specific age group. The processing was applied across the full spectrum of human ages. The processing itself was thorough. Skulls had been reduced to cup-like forms by removing the facial bones and the base of the cranium and preserving only the vault. This is a specific modification with no subsistence utility. Removing the face and base of a skull while leaving the vault intact does not make the skull easier to consume or transport. It makes it a container. Several of these skull cups showed traces of use, suggesting they had functioned as vessels before being deposited. The linear pottery culture at 5000 BCE was not experiencing a documented food crisis. Faunal assemblages at contemporaneous LBK sites show adequate animal protein consumption. The surrounding region was not in a demonstrable state of collapse at the time of Herxheim's activity. There is no strontium or oxygen isotope evidence of climate-induced famine. There is no evidence of siege, of fortification breach, of defensive violence. The people at Herxheim were not eating other people because they were starving. They were eating other people because the system they operated within required it. Here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Herxheim is not a massacre site. It is a processing facility. People were brought to it, or came to it, from hundreds of kilometers across Central Europe. The same culture that built the longhouses of the first European farming settlements, that spread agriculture across an entire continent, that maintained consistent ceramic styles across thousands of kilometers of territory, also maintained a site where people from across that same territory were systematically processed and consumed. The skull cups. The isotopic diversity of the victims. The absence of any survival necessity. The 15 years of reluctance to publish the full implications. Together, they describe something that has no adequate name in modern archaeological terminology. A practice that was organized, sustained, geographically coordinated, and culturally embedded in the same population that was, at the same moment, building the agricultural civilization of prehistoric Europe. The Herxheim site was eventually abandoned around 4950 BCE. The pits were sealed, the activity stopped. Whatever belief system generated it either collapsed or transformed into something that left no comparable physical signature in the archaeological record that follows. We do not know what ended it. We do not know how many sites like it existed and have not yet been found. We do not know how many of the people traveling the trade networks of Neolithic Europe were traveling toward Herxheim. The question isn't whether atrocity is a modern invention. The question is whether anything that follows in the archaeological record actually represents an escalation. And if you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.